Please, don't let me die in a wedding dress. The words ripped from Sarah McAllister's throat as she stumbled through thorny mesquite, white silk shredding with each desperate step. Not her death, someone else's. Someone whose blood was painting the Texas Canyon rocks crimson in the morning sun. Crack. Gunfire exploded across the desert, so close the sound slapped her eardrums. Sarah dove behind granite boulders, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard it, a low moan of agony that made her medical training override every survival instinct. Someone was dying. Right here. Right now. Help me. Came a voice, rough with pain and thirst. Please. Sarah's bare feet found purchase on blood-slicked stone as she climbed toward the voice, her ruined wedding dress. 3 months of preserved sails, imported silk from San Antonio, catching on every thorn. Behind her, Cedar Creek's church bells had finally fallen silent, no longer proclaiming a ceremony that died when Daniel Morrison announced his heart belonged to her best friend instead. I can't marry you, Sarah. Margaret and I, we're in love. 20 minutes ago. 20 minutes since her carefully planned future crumbled in front of ranchers from El Paso and territorial officials in their finest clothes. But that pain felt distant now, eclipsed by immediate crisis. Another gunshot. Closer. Sarah's bare feet found purchase on rocky ground as she climbed toward the sounds, ignoring stones that bit into her soles. Her father, Dr. James McAllister, only physician for 50 miles, had trained her well. Healing came before everything else, even heartbreak. There, sprawled in merciful shadow, lay a man she'd never seen before. Blood seeped from a deep forehead gash, creating dark rivulets through dust and sweat. His left leg bent at a sickening angle. Compound fracture, her medical training cataloged automatically. Dark hair matted with blood and debris. Quality clothes torn and filthy, but expensive underneath. Good boots, well-made leather vest. A working man with money, and someone had tried to kill him. Please, he whispered, green eyes fluttering open like spring grass. Voice rough with pain and thirst. Help. His words shattered something protective in Sarah's chest. This stranger was dying, and she was the only person for miles who could save him. I'm here, she said, pressing her hand to his chest to feel his heartbeat, rapid but strong. What's your name? Ethan. Ethan Walsh. Sarah McAllister. Try to stay still. She was already assessing injuries with practiced efficiency, 15 years of assisting her father taking over. You've been shot. Horse, through me. His eyes tried to focus. After the shooting. After. So he'd been shot first, then thrown. Someone had hunted him like an animal. Hoofbeats approached fast, a lone rider galloping through the canyon. Sarah's pulse spiked until she recognized the sorrel gelding and its rider's guilty posture. Daniel Morrison. Coming to explain his betrayal, no doubt. Sarah's jaw hardened as she looked down at Ethan's pain-glazed eyes. She would not let this wounded stranger suffer while Daniel delivered pathetic excuses. Hold on, Ethan Walsh, she murmured, tearing strips from her petticoat. I don't abandon people. Unlike some. But as she pressed clean fabric to his forehead wound, Ethan's hand caught hers, surprisingly strong for someone losing blood. Sarah, he whispered urgently. The men who shot me, they might come back. You need to. Another gunshot cracked across the canyon, much closer, and this time, it was followed by the sound of multiple horses approaching at a gallop. How many? Sarah whispered, her hands never stopping their work on Ethan's wounds. 3, maybe 4. Ethan's green eyes were alert despite his injuries, scanning the canyon rim with the practiced wariness of someone accustomed to being hunted. They think I'm dead. The approaching hoofbeats weren't coming from Daniel's direction. They were descending from the canyon's eastern rim, the old outlaw trail that honest men avoided. Sarah's blood chilled as she realized these weren't rescuers. They were killers, coming to finish the job. Can you move? She asked, checking his pulse again. Still strong, but the head wound was bleeding too freely. Not far. Not fast. Ethan tried to sit up and immediately went gray with pain. Sarah, listen to me. When they get here, you'll be hidden. She cut him off, her mind racing through possibilities. The canyon offered dozens of hiding spots, but not for a man with a broken leg who'd leave a blood trail a child could follow. Unless. The old mine shaft, she said suddenly, remembering childhood explorations with her father. 50 yards up canyon. Can you make it if I help? What about you? I'll be fine. Sarah was already fashioning a pressure bandage for his head wound, using strips from her wedding dress's silk lining. I'm just a woman out for a walk who got caught in the wrong place. They won't believe that. They will if there's no evidence you were ever here. Working with desperate efficiency, Sarah used her corset stays to splint his leg, another symbolic destruction of her planned life as Daniel's wife. Every movement sent visible jolts of pain through Ethan, but he bit back any sounds that might carry. The hoofbeats were getting closer. She could hear rocks clattering under iron shoes, the jingle of spurs and bit chains. Professional sounds. Men who rode hard and shot straight. Who are they? She whispered as she helped him to his feet, taking most of his weight on her shoulders. Bank robbers. Killers. Ethan's voice was tight with pain and effort. I'm a U.S. Marshal, Sarah. I've been tracking them for months. A federal lawman. That explained the quality gear, the alertness, the way he'd assess threats even while bleeding. But it also meant the men hunting him were desperate enough to kill a marshal and anyone who helped him. The mine shaft, Sarah said grimly, half carrying him up the narrow trail. Then I'm getting you to my father's clinic. Your father? Was the territorial doctor. Died 2 years ago, but the clinic's still equipped. She could see the dark opening ahead, a played-out silver mine that honeycombed the canyon walls. I can treat your injuries properly there. They reached the entrance just as voices echoed from below. Sarah helped Ethan into the shadows, noting how he automatically positioned himself to watch the entrance despite his injuries. Martial instincts, even half-conscious. Stay hidden until I come back, she whispered. No matter what you hear. Sarah, but she was already moving, scrambling back down the trail with her torn skirts bunched around her legs. She had perhaps 2 minutes to eliminate any sign of Ethan's presence before the riders reached his original position. She needn't have worried about evidence. Daniel Morrison was doing that job for her. Sarah, her former groom, had dismounted and was kneeling exactly where Ethan had been lying, his expensive wedding clothes already stained with blood and dirt. My God, what happened here? Whose blood is this? Daniel. Sarah arranged her voice to sound confused, frightened. What are you doing here? I followed you. I was worried. He gestured at the blood-soaked ground. This looks like someone was badly hurt. I don't know. I found it like this. She let her voice shake convincingly. There was so much blood, I thought someone might still be alive, but the sound of approaching riders cut her off. 3 men appeared around the canyon bend, riding hard and looking dangerous. The leader, a lean man with cold eyes and a predatory smile, reined in his horse as he spotted the blood. Well, he said, his voice carrying a faint accent Sarah couldn't place. Looks like we found our trail after all. Daniel rose slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun at his hip. Can I help you, gentlemen? Maybe you can. The leader's eyes fixed on Sarah with uncomfortable intensity. We're tracking a dangerous fugitive. Bank robber, killed a guard in Santa Fe. Trail led us here. There's no one here but us, Daniel said firmly. And as you can see, my fiancé is hardly equipped to harbor fugitives. Fiancé? Sarah almost laughed at the irony. An hour ago, Daniel had abandoned her at the altar. Now he was claiming her as protection against armed men. Funny thing about blood trails, the leader continued, dismounting to examine the stained ground. They tell stories. This one says our man was hurt bad, got treatment from someone who knew medicine. His eyes locked on Sarah's hands, stained with Ethan's blood despite her efforts to clean them. You wouldn't happen to know anything about doctoring, would you, miss? The question was casual, but Sarah heard the steel underneath. These men suspected her, and they wouldn't hesitate to kill both her and Daniel if they thought it necessary. Time to find out just how good an actress a frontier doctor's daughter could be. Doctoring? Sarah forced a nervous laugh, allowing her voice to climb higher. Sir, I can barely bandage a cut finger without fainting. She swayed slightly, as if the sight of blood was overwhelming her delicate feminine sensibilities. Daniel immediately moved to steady her, playing along with an instinct that surprised her. My fiancé is not accustomed to violence, he said protectively. Perhaps we should explain what happened here. The leader, she could see a badge pinned to his vest now, though something about it looked wrong, studied them both with calculating eyes. I'm listening. We came out here to discuss our wedding plans privately, Daniel said, his cheeks reddening with what looked like genuine embarrassment. When we found all this blood. Wedding plans. One of the other riders snorted. Dressed like that. Sarah looked down at her torn and stained wedding dress, realizing how ridiculous their story sounded. But sometimes the most ridiculous stories were the most believable. We had an argument, she said, letting tears pool in her eyes. I ran off, and Daniel followed me. That's when we found. She gestured helplessly at the blood-stained rocks, then buried her face in her hands as if overcome. Through her fingers, she watched the leader's expression soften slightly. Men were always more comfortable with weeping women than strong ones. Argument about what? He pressed. Whether to postpone the ceremony, Daniel said quickly. Sarah's father died recently, and she felt it was too soon for celebration. The lie came so smoothly that Sarah almost believed it herself. But she could see the leader wasn't entirely convinced. His eyes kept returning to her blood-stained hands, to the medical precision of the torn fabric strips scattered around. You said you were tracking a fugitive, Daniel continued. How do you know he came this way? Blood trail from the territorial border. Our man took a bullet in a shootout, been bleeding steady for miles. The leader's hand rested casually on his gun butt. Question is, where'd he go from here? Sarah forced herself to look around, as if seeing the area for the first time. Could he have fallen into the canyon? There are caves and mine shafts all through these rocks. Could have. But the leader was studying the ground more carefully now, noting the scuffed earth where they'd moved Ethan. Or someone could have helped him. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt Daniel tense beside her, his hand moving closer to his own weapon. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Then she heard it, a sound that made her blood freeze. A low rumble from up canyon. Getting louder. Flash flood, Daniel said urgently. We need to get to higher ground. Now. The storm that had been building all morning was finally breaking upstream, sending tons of water racing down the normally dry canyon. Within minutes, this entire area would be underwater. The clinic, Sarah said, pointing toward the adobe structure built into the canyon wall. It's on high ground. But as they hurried toward safety, the leader caught her arm. Not so fast, miss. I think you and I need to have a longer conversation about what really happened here. Sarah looked into his cold eyes and realized with crystalline clarity that he knew. Somehow, despite her performance, he suspected she'd helped the wounded marshal. And he had no intention of letting her reach safety until he got the truth. The rumble was getting louder, echoing off canyon walls like approaching thunder. Soon the flood would be here, and anyone caught in the open would be swept away. But the man holding her arm looked like he'd rather drown than let a potential witness escape. Daniel, she said quietly, never taking her eyes off the leader's face. Run. What? Sarah, I'm not leaving. Run. Now. Because she could see something in the leader's expression that Daniel couldn't. This man was done pretending to be a lawman. And whatever happened next, she didn't want Daniel Morrison's death on her conscience, regardless of what he'd done to her heart. The rumble became a roar, and the first wall of water appeared around the canyon bend, brown and debris-filled, carrying whole trees in its path. Time was up. The adobe clinic sat 30 feet above the canyon floor, built into a natural shelf that had weathered countless flash floods over the decades. Sarah's father had chosen the location well, high enough to stay dry, defensible enough to discourage bandits, close enough to the main trail to be accessible to patients. Now it represented the difference between life and death. Move, Daniel shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her up the narrow trail that led to the clinic door. Behind them, the three riders were spurring their horses toward the same refuge, the approaching flood having temporarily suspended their interrogation. Sarah fumbled with the heavy wooden door, swollen from the recent rains and stiff from disuse. The roar of water was deafening now, echoing off canyon walls like an approaching freight train. Let me, Daniel said, putting his shoulder to the wood. The door burst open, and they tumbled inside just as the first riders reached the trail. The interior was exactly as her father had left it, surgical instruments gleaming in their glass case, bottles of medicine lined up with military precision, everything clean and ready for the next emergency. The familiar sense of carbolic acid and dried herbs brought tears to Sarah's eyes. But there was no time for sentiment. Through the windows, she could see the flood crest racing toward them. a 15-foot wall of brown water and debris that filled the canyon from wall to wall. "Get away from the windows," she called to Daniel, who was helping the three riders secure their horses. The animals were wild-eyed with terror, but seemed to understand they were safer on the rocky shelf than anywhere else. The leader, who'd introduced himself as Marshall Jenkins during their scramble to safety, was studying the clinic's interior with obvious interest. His eyes lingered on the medical supplies, the examination table with its telltale bloodstains from countless surgeries. "Your father was a doctor?" he asked Sarah, his tone casual but his attention sharp. "Yes, Dr. James McAllister." She busied herself lighting oil lamps as the canyon filled with churning water below. "He served this territory for 15 years. And he taught you?" Sarah hesitated. Too much medical knowledge would reinforce his suspicions about the wounded Marshall. Too little would seem suspicious in itself. "Basic nursing," she said finally. "Enough to assist him with simple procedures. Like treating gunshot wounds?" The question was asked quietly, but everyone in the room heard it. Daniel's head snapped up from where he was closing window shutters, and the other two riders, who'd been examining her father's surgical tools, went very still. I've seen father treat them," Sarah said carefully. "But I've never done it myself." "Interesting." Jenkins moved closer to the examination table, running his finger along its edge. "Because someone with considerable skill treated a badly wounded man within the last few hours. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing." Sarah felt the walls closing in around her, but before she could respond, Daniel stepped forward. "Marshall Jenkins, with respect, my fiancée has been with me all morning. If someone was treated here, it wasn't by her." "Is that so?" Jenkins' smile was cold and calculating. "Then perhaps you can explain why there's fresh blood under her fingernails? Or why her dress is stained with the same type of wound pattern we've been following." Sarah looked down at her hands, realizing her mistake. In her hurry to clean up evidence, she'd missed the most obvious signs. Her wedding dress, white silk turned pink with blood stains, told the story more clearly than any words. "I tried to help," she said finally, abandoning the pretense. "When we found all that blood, I thought someone might still be alive. I'm sorry if I disturbed your crime scene." "How thoughtful of you." Jenkins was studying her face now, looking for tells, for signs of deception. "And where exactly is this wounded man now?" Before Sarah could answer, one of the other riders called out from the window. "Boss, you need to see this." They all crowded around the opening, looking down at the canyon below. The flood had passed its peak, leaving behind a landscape transformed. Where there had been rocks and desert scrub, now there was only churning brown water filled with debris, trees, boulders, even the carcass of what looked like a cow. And floating among the wreckage, unmistakable in its bright red fabric, was a man's shirt. "Well," Jenkins said softly, "looks like our fugitive won't be causing any more trouble." Sarah stared at the floating shirt, her heart hammering. Was it Ethan's? Had he been swept away despite her efforts to hide him? The mine shaft where she'd left him was above the flood line. But if he'd tried to move, if his injuries had made him disoriented. "Problem solved," Daniel said with obvious relief. "The man you were tracking is dead." "Maybe." Jenkins wasn't taking his eyes off Sarah. "Or maybe someone wants us to think he's dead." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Sarah forced herself to meet his gaze directly, letting genuine grief show in her expression. Grief that might be all too real if Ethan had indeed perished in the flood. "I hope you find peace in your justice, Marshall," she said quietly. "Even if the price was a human life." "Some lives aren't worth much," Jenkins replied. "Bank robbers, killers, men who prey on innocent folks. The world's better off without them." Something in his tone made Sarah look at him more sharply. There was satisfaction in his voice, yes, but also something else. Something that didn't sound like a lawman satisfied with justice, but like a predator pleased with a successful hunt. And suddenly, she began to wonder if Marshall Jenkins was really what he claimed to be. Outside, the flood waters continued to recede, leaving behind a canyon scoured clean of secrets. But inside the clinic, new mysteries were just beginning to surface. As evening settled over the transformed canyon, the three marshals showed no inclination to leave. The flood had washed out the main trail, they claimed, making travel impossible until morning. They'd settled into the clinic like they owned it, cleaning their weapons and speaking in low voices that stopped whenever Sarah or Daniel came within earshot. Sarah busied herself preparing a simple dinner from the clinic's emergency stores, but her mind was racing. Something was wrong with these men. Everything from their 2 new badges to their casual familiarity with violence set off alarm bells. Real federal marshals would have shown more concern for proper procedures, more respect for civilian property. And there was the matter of their leader's eyes. Jenkins watched her with the calculating gaze of a predator, as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a citizen to be protected. "Sarah," Daniel murmured, moving close as she worked at the small stove. "I don't like this. These men. I know." She kept her voice barely audible. "Something's not right. We should have insisted they leave when the trail cleared." "And go where?" "They've seen too much now." Sarah glanced toward the men, who were examining her father's medical supplies with disturbing interest. "Daniel, I need you to do something for me." "What?" "At first light, ride back to town. Get your brother Tom. Bring a real posse." Daniel's face went pale. "I'm not leaving you alone with them. You have to. If these men aren't real marshals, then you're in danger every second they're here." His voice was firm despite his obvious fear. "I won't abandon you again, Sarah. Not after this morning." The reference to their broken engagement hung between them, but there was no time for that conversation. Jenkins was rising from his chair, moving toward them with the deliberate gait of a man making a decision. "Miss McAllister," he said pleasantly, "mighty fine clinic your father built here. Must have treated all sorts of folks over the years." "He helped anyone who needed it," Sarah replied carefully, "including folks who might not want their business known to the law." The question was pointed, and Sarah realized Jenkins was probing for something specific. "My father took a doctor's oath to help the injured, regardless of their circumstances." "How noble." Jenkins' smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, sometimes helping the wrong people can get a person into considerable trouble." He was standing very close now, close enough that Sarah could smell the gun oil on his clothes, see the pale line on his finger where a different ring had recently been removed. Everything about him suggested a man playing a role he wasn't comfortable with. "Marshal Jenkins," Daniel said firmly, "I think you're making my fiancé uncomfortable." "Am I?" Jenkins turned that predatory smile on Daniel. "How thoughtless of me. Tell me, Morrison, that is your name, isn't it? How long have you known Miss McAllister?" 2 years. We're to be married." "Funny thing about that." Jenkins gestured toward Sarah's torn wedding dress. "Brides' clothes are usually white for a reason. Yours look like they've seen some excitement." Sarah felt her cheeks burn, but before she could respond, one of the other men called out from the window. "Boss, we got company." Everyone rushed to look out into the gathering darkness. A lone rider was picking his way carefully down the canyon wall, using a trail Sarah didn't recognize. Even in the dim light, she could see he was moving with the caution of someone who expected trouble. "You expecting anyone?" Jenkins asked, his hand moving to his gun. "No," Sarah said, but her heart was racing. Could it be help? Or was this another complication in an already dangerous situation? The rider reached the canyon floor and approached the clinic directly, showing no signs of stealth or concealment. As he drew closer, Sarah could make out more details. A big man on a tired horse, wearing clothes that had seen hard travel. "Federal Marshal," the rider called out as he approached. "Deputy Rodriguez, Territorial Office. Anyone in there?" Sarah felt Jenkins tense beside her, his whole body going rigid with what looked like alarm rather than relief. "Answer him," Jenkins ordered quietly, his voice completely different now. Harder, more threatening. "We're here," Sarah called back. "Come on up." But as Deputy Rodriguez dismounted and began climbing the trail to the clinic, Jenkins grabbed her arm in a grip that made her gasp. "Listen carefully," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "You're going to tell this lawman that everything here is fine, that we're federal marshals conducting official business. Any deviation from that story, and your boyfriend dies. Understand?" Sarah looked into his eyes and saw the truth at last. These weren't federal marshals at all. They were the bank robbers Ethan had been tracking. And now a real lawman was walking into their trap. "I understand," she whispered back. But even as she spoke, her mind was working furiously. Rodriguez was armed and alert, a professional who might recognize these imposters for what they really were. If she could find a way to warn him without getting Daniel killed. The deputy's boots rang on the wooden steps outside, and Jenkins released her arm with a warning look. "Remember," he said softly, "one wrong word." Sarah nodded, but her hand was already moving toward the medical tray where her father's sharpest scalpel lay gleaming in the lamplight. If these men thought she'd go quietly to her death, they were about to learn better. The real fight was just beginning. Deputy Rodriguez knocked firmly on the clinic door, the sound echoing through the tense silence inside. Sarah could feel Jenkins' eyes burning into her as she moved to answer, his warning about one wrong word ringing in her ears. "Coming," she called, buying precious seconds to think. Daniel stood frozen near the window, clearly sensing the danger but not understanding its full scope. The other two fake marshals had positioned themselves on either side of the door, hands resting casually on their weapons. Everything depended on the next few minutes. Sarah opened the door with what she hoped was a welcoming smile. "Deputy Rodriguez, what brings you out here so late?" The man who stood on her threshold was everything Jenkins wasn't. Genuinely weathered by honest work, with kind eyes and the relaxed confidence of someone comfortable with his authority. His badge was worn smooth by years of wear, not shiny and new like the others. "Evening, miss. Got word there might be trouble in this area. Flash flood reports, missing persons." His eyes took in her torn wedding dress, the stress evident in her face. "You folks all right?" "We're fine," Sarah said, acutely aware of Jenkins behind her. "Just waiting for the trail to clear." "These gentlemen are federal marshals," Daniel added, trying to be helpful. "They were tracking a fugitive." Rodriguez's expression shifted subtly, and Sarah caught a flicker of something, recognition, suspicion, in his eyes as he looked past her to study the men inside. "Federal marshals, you say?" He stepped into the clinic uninvited, his hand resting on his gun butt. "Don't recall any federal operations being reported through our office." "Special assignment," Jenkins said smoothly, but Sarah caught the edge in his voice. "Direct from the territorial capital." "I see." Rodriguez was studying Jenkins' badge now, and Sarah could practically see him cataloging details. "Mind if I see your federal commission?" The silence stretched too long. Sarah felt the tension ratcheting up like a spring under pressure, everyone aware that the pretense was about to collapse. "Actually," Rodriguez continued conversationally, "I think I need to ask you gentlemen to step outside. Official business." That's when Jenkins made his move. "I don't think so, deputy," he said, drawing his gun in one smooth motion. "I think you need to mind your own business." Rodriguez was fast. His own weapon was halfway out of its holster when the other two fake marshals flanked him. 3 against 1, caught in the open with nowhere to take cover. "Easy now," Rodriguez said calmly, though his eyes were sharp with calculation. "No need for anyone to get hurt. Depends on how cooperative everyone wants to be." Jenkins replied. "See, we've got ourselves a situation here. You walked into something you weren't invited to. And what's that?" "The end of U.S. Marshal Ethan Walsh." Jenkins' smile was cold and satisfied. "Though it looks like the canyon flood saved us the trouble." Sarah's heart stopped. Rodriguez's eyes flicked to her, and she saw understanding dawn in his expression, understanding and something that looked like hope. "Ethan Walsh," Rodriguez said carefully. "You know Deputy Marshal Walsh?" "Know him. We've been hunting him for months." Jenkins was enjoying himself now. The pretense finally dropped. "Him and his partner, thinking they could track us across 3 territories. His partner, dead. Tucson ambush, 2 weeks ago." Jenkins gestured toward the window where debris still floated in the receding floodwaters. "Walsh lasted longer, but that red shirt floating down there says his luck finally ran out." Rodriguez nodded slowly, but his eyes had gone hard as flint. "That's interesting, because I just came from the territorial office. Got a telegram this morning about Deputy Walsh. Seems he's been tracking a gang of bank robbers led by a man named Jake Garrett." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as she recognized the name Ethan had whispered. These weren't just any criminals. They were the specific gang he'd been hunting. "Never heard of him," Jenkins said, but his gun had moved to point directly at Rodriguez's chest. "Funny thing about that," the deputy continued, his voice steady despite the weapon aimed at his heart. "Because according to the Telegraph, Jake Garrett has a distinctive scar on his left hand. Shape of a crescent moon from a knife fight in Yuma." All eyes went to Jenkins' left hand, and the crescent-shaped scar clearly visible on his knuckles. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Rodriguez smiled grimly. "Hello, Jake. Been looking for you for a long time." That's when all hell broke loose. Jenkins fired first, but Rodriguez was already moving, diving behind the heavy examination table as the bullet splintered wood where his head had been. Sarah screamed and dropped to the floor as gunfire erupted in the confined space, deafeningly loud and filled with the sharp smell of gunpowder. Daniel grabbed her and pulled her behind the medicine cabinet, his face white with terror. "Stay down." But through the chaos of gunshots and shouting, Sarah heard something that made her heart leap with impossible hope. The sound of return fire coming from outside the clinic. Someone else was in the canyon. Someone with a rifle and the skill to use it. And as a bullet shattered the oil lamp and plunged the clinic into darkness, she dared to hope that Ethan Walsh wasn't dead after all. Muzzle flashes lit the clinic like lightning, turning everything into a nightmare of shadows and violence. Sarah pressed herself against the floor behind the medicine cabinet, Daniel's body shielding her from the worst of the crossfire. Glass bottles exploded around them as bullets found her father's carefully organized supplies, filling the air with the sharp scents of alcohol and medicinal herbs. But the gunfire from outside was getting closer, more coordinated. Someone was advancing on the clinic with professional precision, laying down covering fire while Rodriguez held his position behind the examination table. "Jake," one of the fake marshals shouted over the chaos. "There's someone out there." "Multiple shooters." "Impossible," Garrett snarled back, but Sarah could hear uncertainty in his voice. "Walsh is dead." As if in answer, a rifle bullet shattered the window nearest to Garrett's position, forcing him to dive for cover. The shot was followed by a voice that made Sarah's heart soar with relief and terror in equal measure. "Federal Marshal, you're surrounded. Throw down your weapons." Ethan. Somehow, impossibly, he was alive and mobile enough to fight. "Like hell," Garrett shouted back, but his position was rapidly becoming untenable. Rodriguez was pinning him down from inside, while rifle fire from outside made movement suicidal. "Sarah," Ethan's voice carried clearly through the gunfire. "If you can hear me, stay down." She wanted to call back, to let him know she was alive, but Daniel's hand clamped over her mouth as another volley of shots peppered the clinic walls. Smart man, any sound from her position would draw fire. "Boss," one of Garrett's men called desperately, "we need to move. They're flanking us." Sarah could see their dilemma. The clinic that had seemed like a fortress was now a trap. Limited exits, stone walls that contained ricochets, and federal lawmen closing in from multiple directions. But desperate men made dangerous choices. "The woman," Garrett snarled suddenly. "Get the woman." Sarah's blood froze as she realized his plan. If they couldn't fight their way out, they'd take hostages, and she was the most vulnerable target in the room. One of Garrett's men broke from cover, lunging toward her hiding spot. Daniel tried to intercept him, but caught a rifle butt to the temple that dropped him like a stone. Sarah scrambled backward, her hands finding the handle of her father's surgical case. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," the outlaw growled, reaching for her. Sarah's fingers closed around the bone saw. 8 inches of razor-sharp steel designed for cutting through the toughest human tissue. When the man grabbed her arm, she brought the blade up in a vicious arc that opened his throat from ear to jaw. He dropped without a sound, blood pumping across the clinic floor. "Sally's dead," the remaining outlaw shouted, his voice high with panic. "The woman killed Sally." Garrett's response was a stream of profanity that would have made a cavalry sergeant blush. But through the crude language, Sarah caught the desperation. These men were running out of options, ammunition, and time. "Last chance." Ethan's voice came from just outside the shattered window. "Surrender now, or we come in shooting." "Go to hell," Garrett screamed back. More rifle fire erupted, but now it was concentrated on the clinic's front wall. Sarah realized with growing horror that the lawmen were preparing for a final assault, and she was directly in the line of fire. "The back room," Rodriguez shouted to her over the noise. "There's a back room." Sarah looked where he was pointing and saw her father's old office. Thick walls, only one small window, and a heavy oak door that could stop most bullets. But to reach it, she'd have to cross 15 feet of open floor while bullets flew in all directions. Daniel was stirring, blood running from his head wound, but his eyes focusing. "Sarah," he mumbled, "run." She looked at the distance to safety, calculated the odds, and made her choice. But as she gathered herself to sprint across the killing zone, the front door exploded inward, and Jake Garrett himself appeared in the opening. Not retreating, but advancing with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. "If I'm going to die," he snarled, his gun trained directly on Sarah's chest, "I'm taking someone with me." Time slowed to crystalline clarity. Sarah could see his finger tightening on the trigger, could see the murderous rage in his eyes, could feel her death approaching with mechanical inevitability. Then the world exploded in a thunderclap of gunfire and splintering wood. The gunshot that should have killed Sarah instead punched through Jake Garrett's shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying across the clinic floor. He crashed into the medicine cabinet, bottles raining down around him in a shower of glass and liquid. In the doorway stood Ethan Walsh, pale and swaying, but very much alive, his service revolver smoking in his hand. "Should have made sure I was dead," he said grimly. But the effort of the shot had cost him. Sarah could see fresh blood seeping through his shirt, could see the way his left leg trembled with the strain of standing. His escape from the mine shaft and the battle to reach the clinic had reopened his wounds and pushed him far beyond his physical limits. Garrett was down but not out, his good hand scrambling for a backup gun. Rodriguez put an end to that with a well-placed kick that sent the weapon skittering away. "It's over, Jake," the deputy said calmly, training his gun on the wounded outlaw. "Your men are dead or scattered. No point in more killing." "There's always a point," Garrett snarled, but the fight was going out of him along with his blood. Sarah rushed to Ethan's side as he sagged against the doorframe. Up close, she could see the full cost of his heroic rescue. His face was gray with pain and blood loss, his breathing shallow and rapid. "You magnificent idiot," she whispered, helping to support his weight. "You were supposed to stay hidden. Heard the shooting. Couldn't leave you." His green eyes found hers, and despite everything they'd been through, she saw warmth there. "Told you nothing would happen to you. How did you even get here?" "The mine shaft, connected to the old Spanish tunnels. Took me a while to find the right exit." He managed a weak smile. "Helped that you described the clinic's location so well." Daniel was sitting up now, holding his head and looking dazed but functional. "Sarah, are you hurt?" "I'm fine." But she wasn't looking at Daniel as she said it. Her attention was entirely focused on the wounded marshal who'd risked everything to save her life. "We need to get him to the examination table," she told Rodriguez. "He's lost too much blood." "Sarah," Ethan said quietly as they helped him across the room, "there's something you need to know. About why they were hunting me. About what I've been doing out here. It can wait until I've treated your wounds." "No, it can't." His voice was urgent despite his weakness. "Because what comes next, it's going to change everything." She paused in her examination of his reopened leg wound. "What are you talking about?" "The territorial governor has been looking for someone to establish a federal law enforcement presence in this region. Someone with local knowledge, medical training, and the courage to stand up to dangerous men." His eyes met hers directly. "Someone like you." Sarah felt her breath catch. "Me? Federal medical examiner and deputy marshal. Full authority to practice medicine and enforce territorial law throughout the Southwest." Ethan's voice was growing stronger as he spoke, fueled by the importance of what he was saying. "The position comes with a salary, federal protection, and complete independence from local politics." The implications hit her like a physical blow. Everything she'd ever dreamed of, the chance to practice medicine freely, to help people without social restrictions, to build a life based on her own choices rather than others' expectations. But it would also mean leaving everything familiar behind. Leaving Cedar Creek, leaving the only home she'd ever known. Leaving Daniel. "Sarah," her former fiancé said quietly from across the room, his voice thick with understanding and something that might have been regret. "Take it." She turned to stare at him in shock. "Daniel, take the position." He was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen before, genuine respect, tinged with sadness. "It's what you were meant for. What you've always been meant for. But what about?" She gestured helplessly between them. "What about us?" Daniel's smile was rueful but genuine. "Sarah, I've watched you tonight. The way you saved his life, stood up to armed killers, made impossible choices without hesitation. You're not meant to be anyone's wife. You're meant to be yourself." The words should have hurt, but instead they felt like liberation. Daniel was finally seeing her clearly, not as a convenient solution to his domestic needs, but as the strong, capable woman she'd always been. "The offer comes with one condition," Ethan said quietly. Sarah turned back to him, her heart hammering. What condition? You wouldn't have to work alone. The federal government is also establishing a territorial marshal's office for this region. His green eyes were serious but warm. If you're interested in a professional partnership with someone who's learned that the best adventures are shared ones. The proposal, both professional and personal, hung in the air between them. Sarah looked around the destroyed clinic, at the wounded outlaw bleeding on her father's floor, at Daniel sitting amid the wreckage of their planned life together. Then she looked at Ethan Walsh, who saw her for exactly who she was and valued her for exactly those qualities. Marshal Walsh, she said formally, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I believe I would find such a partnership very agreeable indeed. Then it's settled, he replied, his voice warm with relief and something deeper. Partners in law enforcement, partners in medicine, partners in life. Partners in everything, Sarah agreed. And as Rodriguez moved to secure Jake, Garrett, and Daniel began cleaning up the aftermath of the battle, Sarah felt a happiness so profound it seemed to light up the entire canyon. She had chosen her path at last, not the safe road or the expected one, but the right one. The one that led toward everything she'd ever dared to dream. Dawn was breaking over the canyon when the real posse arrived from Cedar Creek. Sarah watched from the clinic's bullet-scarred doorway as Sheriff Tom Morrison led a dozen riders down the treacherous trail, their faces grim with the kind of determination that came from riding all night to reach potential trouble. Behind Tom rode the entire town council, Reverend Matthews, and a collection of prominent citizens who'd clearly expected to find either a rescue situation or a funeral. What they found instead was Deputy Rodriguez securing prisoners, a clinic that looked like a battlefield, and Sarah McAllister, still in her torn wedding dress, professionally treating wounded men with the efficiency of a seasoned frontier doctor. Sarah, Tom Morrison dismounted and rushed toward the clinic, his face a mixture of relief and confusion. My God, are you hurt? When Daniel's horse came back without him. I'm fine, Tom, Sarah replied calmly, not looking up from where she was suturing a graze on Ethan's arm. Daniel's inside, resting. He took a knock to the head, but he'll recover. Tom's eyes took in the scene. The bloodstains, the shattered windows, the bodies covered with blankets outside the door. What in hell happened here? Bank robbers. Deputy Rodriguez answered for her, emerging from the clinic with Jake Garrett in shackles. Gang that's been operating across 3 territories. They've been impersonating federal marshals to track down the real lawman who was hunting them. This is Deputy Marshal Ethan Walsh, Sarah added, finally looking up from her work. He's been pursuing these criminals for months. But it was Reverend Matthews who voiced what everyone was thinking. Miss McAllister, while we're grateful you're safe, I have to ask, what exactly is your relationship with this federal marshal? The question carried obvious disapproval, and Sarah felt the familiar weight of social expectations pressing down on her. Here it was again, the demand that she explain herself, justify her choices, conform to others' ideas of proper feminine behavior. 6 hours ago, she might have stammered out excuses and apologies. Now, she simply looked the Reverend in the eye and said, Deputy Marshal Walsh is my partner. Partner? Tom Morrison's eyebrows shot up. Sarah, what does that mean exactly? It means, Ethan said, struggling to sit up despite his injuries, that Miss McAllister has accepted a federal appointment as Territorial Medical Examiner. She'll be working with the U.S. Marshals Service to establish law enforcement and medical services throughout this region. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could practically hear the townspeople's brains struggling to process this information. Their quiet, unmarriageable spinster doctor's daughter had somehow become a federal official overnight. That's impossible, Reverend Matthews spluttered. A woman can't hold such a position. It's completely inappropriate, completely outside the bounds of. Actually, Rodriguez interrupted, producing an official document from his saddlebags. It's completely legal. Federal appointment, signed by the territorial governor himself. Miss McAllister has full authority to practice medicine and assist in law enforcement throughout the Southwest Territories. Sarah watched the Reverend's face go through several interesting color changes as he absorbed this information. Around him, the other townspeople were murmuring among themselves, some shocked, some disapproving, but others nodding with what looked like growing respect. But what about propriety? One of the council members demanded. A young unmarried woman, living alone, working with men in dangerous situations. Won't be unmarried long, Ethan said quietly. Every head turned toward him, and Sarah felt her cheeks burn as she realized what he was about to do. Miss McAllister, he said formally, his green eyes warm despite the formal tone. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife as well as my professional partner? The proposal rang across the canyon like a bell, clear and unmistakable. Sarah looked around at the assembled faces, some shocked, some disapproving, some curious to see what she would say. Then she looked at Ethan Walsh, who had risked his life to save hers, who valued her skills and respected her courage, who saw her as she truly was rather than who others wanted her to be. Yes, she said simply. The word seemed to unlock something in the assembled crowd. Suddenly everyone was talking at once, exclaiming, objecting, congratulating, demanding explanations. But Sarah barely heard them. All her attention was focused on the man whose proposal had just changed her life completely. When? She asked quietly. Soon as we can find a preacher brave enough to perform the ceremony. Ethan replied with a grin. Reverend Matthews cleared his throat importantly. Well, I suppose I could. Actually, Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying clearly across the canyon. I think we'll find someone who believes in what we're doing. Someone who understands that love and respect matter more than social convention. The Reverend's face went purple, but before he could respond, Daniel Morrison emerged from the clinic. His head was bandaged and he moved carefully, but his expression was calm and resolute. Congratulations, Sarah, he said simply. I hope you'll be very happy. The words carried no bitterness, only a kind of sad recognition. Sarah felt a wave of gratitude toward the man who could have made this moment ugly but chose grace instead. Thank you, Daniel. That means a great deal. He nodded once, then turned to address the crowd. I think we should all be proud to have someone like Sarah representing our territory. She's exactly the kind of person this country needs more of. As Daniel mounted his horse and rode away, not toward town, but toward the Whitmore Ranch where his new life waited, Sarah felt the last threads of her old existence finally snap. She was free. Free to choose her own path. Free to use her skills without apology. Free to love a man who valued her strength rather than fearing it. The sun climbed higher over the canyon walls, painting everything in shades of gold and promise. And Sarah McAllister, soon to be Sarah Walsh, stood in the doorway of her father's clinic, federal badge gleaming on her chest, and faced the future without fear. 8 months later, the autumn sun painted the canyon walls in brilliant shades of crimson and gold as Dr. Sarah Walsh stepped out of the newly expanded clinic, now bearing a professional sign that read, Dr. Sarah Walsh, Federal Medical Examiner and Territorial Health Officer. The morning air carried the crisp promise of winter, and she could smell coffee brewing and bacon frying from the comfortable cabin that Ethan had built adjacent to the clinic, their home, their headquarters, and the center of a growing network of law enforcement and medical services. She paused on the clinic's new front porch to savor a moment of quiet before what promised to be another busy day. In the 8 months since her appointment, word had spread throughout the Southwest about the federal medical examiner who could treat everything from difficult childbirths to complex surgeries, who traveled wherever she was needed and asked no questions about a patient's past or ability to pay. Miners and ranchers, soldiers and settlers, even the occasional reformed outlaw seeking medical attention had found their way to the Canyon Clinic. More importantly, Sarah had established satellite medical posts in 3 other territorial towns, training local women in basic health care and emergency medicine. The sound of approaching horses made her look up with a smile. Ethan was returning from his latest assignment, a week spent escorting prisoners to the territorial capital and consulting with the governor about expanding federal law enforcement throughout the region. The sight of him riding up the canyon trail never failed to make her heart skip a beat. He dismounted with the fluid grace of a man whose injuries had healed completely, though Sarah knew his left leg would always be slightly stiff in cold weather. The limp that had worried them both had faded to barely noticeable, and his strength had returned fully during their long rides across the territory. "How did it go?" she asked as he wrapped his arms around her, spinning her around despite her laughing protests. "Better than expected." His expression grew serious as he set her down. "The governor offered me the position of Chief Territorial Marshal. It would mean less travel, more administrative work, coordinating law enforcement across the entire Southwest." Sarah's heart leaped, though she kept her voice carefully neutral. What did you tell him? That I'd need to discuss it with my wife and my medical partner. Ethan's eyes were warm with private meaning, both of whom happened to be the same remarkable woman. Your remarkably practical partner, Sarah said solemnly, thinks that sounds like an excellent opportunity for both of us. They were interrupted by the arrival of a familiar rider, Maria Santos, the territory's most reliable mail carrier, approaching with official pouches and her usual broad grin. Dr. Walsh, Marshall Walsh, Maria called out as she reined in her lathered horse. Got mail from the territorial capital and news that'll interest you both. Sarah and Ethan exchanged glances as Maria dismounted and handed over a thick envelope bearing the territorial seal. Official correspondence was never trivial in their line of work. What's the news? Ethan asked as he opened the envelope with practiced efficiency. Maria's weathered face lit up with pleasure at being the bearer of good tidings. The territorial legislature just voted to establish the Southwest Medical College, first institution west of the Mississippi designed specifically to train women doctors for frontier service. Sarah felt her breath catch as the implications hit her. A real medical school, designed for women, dedicated to frontier medicine, everything her father had dreamed of when he'd encouraged her to pursue formal training. Gets better, Maria continued, clearly enjoying her role as herald. They're looking for experienced practitioners to help design the curriculum and serve as founding faculty. Someone with practical experience in everything from surgery to epidemic management. Someone who understands the unique challenges of territorial medicine. Ethan was reading the official letter, his eyebrows rising as he absorbed its contents. Sarah, he said quietly, they're offering you the position of founding professor of frontier medicine. Full salary, research funding, and the authority to establish medical training standards for the entire territorial system. The letter passed between them as Sarah read the formal offer with growing amazement. The territorial governor himself had signed the appointment, and the compensation offered was more than generous, enough to fund their field operations while building the medical school. There's more, Maria said, her grin widening. Remember that certain Reverend Matthews who tried to cause trouble for you folks? Seems he filed a formal complaint about your federal appointment, claiming it violated divine law or some such nonsense. What kind of response did he get? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. The kind that suggested the good Reverend might want to concern himself more with ministering to his flock and less with interfering in federal business. Apparently, the governor's been getting reports about your work from all over the territory. Lives saved, epidemics prevented, dangerous criminals apprehended with your assistance. Ethan slipped his arm around Sarah's waist as they absorbed this latest validation of the path they'd chosen together. It seems, he said quietly, that following your conscience has worked out rather well. As Maria prepared to continue her route, she paused to deliver one final piece of information. Almost forgot. Ran into Tom Morrison in Santa Fe last week. He asked me to tell you that Cedar Creek's been having some difficulties lately. Sarah raised an eyebrow. What kind of difficulties? Their new doctor, the man they hired to replace you, turned out to be incompetent. 3 preventable deaths, several botched surgeries, and a minor cholera outbreak that he failed to identify until it was almost too late. Maria's expression grew serious. Tom said if you ever wanted to return to private practice in town, the community would welcome you back with considerable enthusiasm. Sarah and Ethan exchanged a look that needed no words. The offer of rehabilitation was flattering, but the life they'd built together was exactly what they both wanted. Challenging, meaningful, and completely their own. Thank Maria for the information, Sarah said diplomatically, but tell anyone who asks that Dr. and Marshall Walsh are quite content with their current arrangements. After Maria departed in her usual cloud of dust and determination, Sarah and Ethan walked together toward the clinic where their first patients of the day were already waiting. A pregnant rancher's wife who'd ridden 20 miles for prenatal care, a young cowboy with what looked like a complicated fracture, and a nervous-looking businessman who claimed to need treatment for a confidential matter. Any regrets? Ethan asked softly as they paused on the clinic's threshold. Sarah considered the question seriously, looking back over the 8 months that had transformed her from an abandoned bride into a federally appointed doctor with a teaching position at a territorial medical college. She thought about the morning that had started with her running from a church in her torn wedding dress, heartbroken and humiliated, believing her life was over. She thought about Daniel and Margaret, who, according to territorial gossip, were struggling to make their marriage work amid financial pressures, and the realization that love based on convenience wasn't the same as love based on genuine partnership. She thought about the dozens of patients she'd treated, the miners with crushed limbs who'd kept their hands because of her surgical skill, the children with fever who'd lived because she'd recognized the early signs of serious illness, the women in difficult labor who'd survived because she'd been there with knowledge and equipment when they needed it most. Most of all, she thought about the man standing beside her, her husband, her partner, her equal in every way that mattered. Ethan had never asked her to be anything other than herself, had never suggested that her ambitions were inappropriate or her capabilities limited by her gender. He had simply accepted her as she was and helped her become everything she could be. Only one regret, she said finally, echoing words she'd spoken in this same spot months earlier. Ethan's eyebrows rose in concern, and Sarah smiled at his immediate worry for her happiness. I regret that it took me so long to realize that sometimes the worst disasters are actually life clearing away the wrong path, so you can find the right one. She squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar warmth and strength of his calloused fingers. If Daniel hadn't left me at that altar, I never would have found you. I never would have discovered what I was really capable of. Ethan's smile was soft and full of love as he brought her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. Then I guess we both owe him a debt of gratitude. We do indeed, Sarah agreed, leaning into her husband's warm embrace as the morning sun climbed higher in the vast western sky. As they entered the clinic together to begin another day of healing and protecting, Sarah reflected on the strange turns that had brought her to this moment. 8 months ago, she had been running from heartbreak, believing herself abandoned and worthless. Now she was Dr. Sarah Walsh, federal medical examiner, founding professor at the Southwest Medical College, and partner to a man who saw her as she truly was. The desert wind whispered through the canyon, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of adventure. Somewhere out there were people who needed healing, criminals who needed apprehending, and challenges yet to be discovered. And she would meet them all as herself, not as someone's abandoned bride or anyone's idea of what a proper woman should be, but as Dr. Sarah Walsh, territorial medical officer, professor, wife, and partner in the grandest adventure of all. In the examination room, the pregnant rancher's wife was describing her symptoms with the matter-of-fact stoicism of frontier women everywhere, while the young cowboy waited his turn with patient resignation. These were her people now, not the social arbiters of Cedar Creek with their narrow definitions of propriety, but the hardy souls who valued competence over convention and results over reputation. Everything looks excellent, she told the expectant mother after a thorough examination. The baby should arrive right around Christmas, and I see no complications. Thank you, doctor, the woman replied with genuine warmth. My husband wanted to take me to Santa Fe, but I told him Dr. Walsh is the finest doctor in 3 territories. Doesn't matter if you're a man or woman when you're saving lives. As Sarah moved on to examine the cowboy's clearly broken wrist, she caught Ethan's eye through the open doorway, where he was reviewing territorial reports and wanted posters. He winked at her with obvious pride, and she felt her heart swell with happiness so profound it seemed to fill the entire canyon. This was her life now. Challenging, meaningful, shared with a partner who valued her for exactly who she was. She was Dr. Sarah Walsh, and she had never been happier to be herself. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly toward the horizon, vast and beautiful and full of possibilities. The sun climbed higher in the turquoise sky, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and rose, bearing witness to another day in the life of a woman who had discovered that sometimes the greatest disasters were actually disguised blessings, and that the courage to be yourself was the most valuable medicine of all. In the distance, a hawk soared in lazy circles, wild and free and answering to no one's expectations but its own, much like the life Sarah had found when she stopped trying to fit into someone else's idea of who she should be and started becoming who she was meant to be all along.